My wife's family tried to erase our prenup the moment I became wealthy, so I played a card that shut their whole family down. I used to think love was enough, that if I worked hard, stayed loyal, and showed up every day for the woman I loved, everything would fall into place. But nothing prepares you for the moment you realize your wife's family never saw you as one of their own, only as a threat to their money. When I married Ellie, I was a broke software developer with a dream and a 10-year-old laptop. Her parents, Richard and Marilyn, came from old money. Her father ran a string of luxury car dealerships, and her mother owned a design firm that catered to Colorado's elite. From day one, they made it clear I didn't belong in their world. They insisted I sign a prenup before the wedding. I did it without blinking just to prove I wasn't after their fortune. Years later, after I'd built my own tech company and our net worth flipped upside down, they came back with wide grins and fake warmth, telling me maybe it was time to reevaluate the prenup. For Ellie's sake, for the family. That's when I knew they never expected me to win, and they sure as hell weren't ready for the version of me who did. You want to know what happens when the broke guy marries rich, gets richer, and refuses to play their game? Good, because I'm going to tell you everything. I had just landed my first real job as a junior software engineer at a mid-sized firm in Seattle. It wasn't glamorous. I was living in a studio apartment, eating microwave noodles and checking my bank account before every gas fill up. But I felt like I was finally getting started. That's when I met Ellie. We bumped into each other at a local coffee shop, literally. I spilled an entire Americano on her sketchbook. I was mortified. She just laughed and said, well, that drawing sucked anyway. From there, we struck up a conversation, and before I knew it, I was offering to buy her another coffee, this time one that didn't come with a stain. Ellie was different. She was sharp, witty, and warm in a way that disarmed me. She was working on her master's in education and had this dream of starting a community school. She talked about kids and social equity with the kind of passion you can't fake. I was drawn in from the first moment. It didn't matter that her family had money or that mine did. Our first few months were all late-night drives, cheap tacos, and endless conversations about our dreams. She used to joke that my car smelt like desperation and ambition. I told her it smelt like a man trying to build something from nothing. She liked that. In the beginning, her family was polite but distant. Her dad would ask pointed questions about my long-term vision, and her mom would compliment my ambition with a kind of forced smile. I brushed it off. I figured they were just protective. Ellie, on the other hand, was all in. She believed in me more than I believed in myself. I remember one night when I was stressing over a bug in a project that I couldn't fix. I was ready to quit the job, convinced I wasn't cut out for tech. Ellie sat beside me, reading Stack Overflow posts and debugging with me until 2 a.m. She didn't understand half of it, but she stayed. She was always there. When I got laid off during a round of company cuts, I was crushed. I felt like a failure. Ellie didn't flinch. She bought groceries that month and told me to take the time to find something that inspired me. You're not your job, she said. You're more than a paycheck. A year into dating, I proposed to her at Discovery Park, right where we had our first walk together. She said yes through tears, and for a while, I really thought that was my fairy tale moment. Then came the prenup. Her father invited me to dinner, just the two of us. I knew something was off the moment I stepped into his study. He poured us drinks and talked about responsibility, legacy, and protecting Ellie's future. Then he handed me a contract. This is standard, he said. We'd ask anyone to sign this. It's just business. It felt anything but standard. The agreement said that in the event of a divorce, I'd walk away with only what I earned, no claims to any of Ellie's assets, inheritances, or family holdings. I was hurt. I tried to talk to Ellie about it that night. She said, "It doesn't change how I feel about you. It's just something to make my parents feel better. Please don't make this a big deal." So I signed it. I told myself I wasn't marrying her for money. I still believe that. But I also realize now that signing that paper set a precedent. one that would haunt me for years. Still, we got married in a beautiful ceremony near the lake. My family came in from Idaho wearing mismatched suits and bringing baked casseroles and coolers. Her family flew in guests from the East Coast and rented a live band. There were awkward smiles, stiff hugs, and too many moments where I felt like I didn't belong. But Ellie held my hand through all of it, and I kept telling myself that was all I needed. I remember catching my dad tearing up during our first dance. He never cried. I asked him about it later, and he just said, "You've always been the underdog, son. I just hope they see how lucky they are to have you." At the time, I thought they would. Now I know better. Looking back now, I realize how much of myself I gave to that relationship freely and without keeping score. I accepted the discomfort, the little humiliations, the quiet digs from her family because I thought love meant sacrifice. I convinced myself that one day they'd see the man behind the bank account. That day never came. But at the time, none of that mattered. Ellie was my person, and I was hers, or so I thought. After the wedding, Ellie and I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of Seattle. We couldn't afford much, but we were proud of what we had. I took freelance gigs on weekends to make ends meet, and Ellie began teaching at a local charter school. Our life was simple, a little chaotic, but full of effort and intention. Her parents, though, never stopped seeing me as the guy she married out of love, not logic. I could hear it in their voices, in their compliments that weren't really compliments. "Must be nice not having to worry about appearances," Marilyn would say as she glanced at my thrift store shoes. Or, "Ellie's always had such expensive taste. I hope you can keep up." Richard wasn't as sly. He once asked in front of friends at a holiday dinner, "So, are you still doing that computer thing, or have you found a real job yet?" Ellie laughed it off. I laughed it off. But later that night, I stared at our cracked ceiling and felt like I'd been punched in the chest. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to start a fight. I told myself I was being too sensitive, but the pattern continued. They questioned every decision we made, from where we lived to how we vacationed. I once suggested a camping trip to Olympic National Park, and Marilyn said, "Oh, so you're still into that budget lifestyle?" The digs weren't limited to words. Every time we visited their house, I felt like a guest on trial. They'd offer me a wine I couldn't pronounce and laugh when I chose beer instead. They'd make casual jokes about the neighborhood we lived in. Ellie would squeeze my hand under the table, but she never spoke up. That's what hurt the most, not the words from her family, but the silence from my wife. Even holidays became a gauntlet. One Christmas, they handed out gifts in order of price, from most expensive to least. Mine came last. A toolkit. Not even a nice one, just a generic box with "For the DIY man" on the label. "Thought you could use this for your little projects," Richard said with a smirk. I told Ellie I didn't care, but I did. There was also the way they treated my family. My parents were kind, down-to-earth people, and they tried their best to connect. But Richard looked at my dad like he was a mechanic in a borrowed tux, and Marilyn avoided my mom like she might catch middle class. After a while, my family stopped coming around. They didn't say why. They didn't have to. I tried to shield Ellie from how I felt. I didn't want to drag her into a battle between me and her parents. I told myself again and again that one day I'd prove myself, that they'd come around. But love shouldn't have to prove itself. And I was slowly starting to understand that. The final straw of that period came during our second anniversary dinner hosted by her parents at their house. They served lobster and made a toast to Ellie's future, not our future, just hers, as if I wasn't even in the room. That night, Ellie and I fought for the first time in months. I asked her, gently, why she didn't say anything when her dad made those comments. She said, "It's not worth the drama, Matt. He's old school." "Old school doesn't mean cruel," I said. She didn't respond. That silence told me everything. The more I tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became. I started noticing how Ellie had slowly begun to mirror their tone, even if unintentionally. When I'd mention a new project or idea, she'd say things like, "Do you really think that's practical right now? Or maybe we should wait until things are more stable." It wasn't the words that stung, it was the tone, that slight air of doubt, like she was no longer sure if I had what it took. I remember one Sunday morning sitting across from her at our little kitchen table. I was excited about a client that wanted me to help redesign their app. It was a small job, but it could have led to more work. I told her about it, expecting the same encouragement she used to give me. Instead, she just stirred her coffee and said, "You know, my parents could help us out if we're struggling. We don't have to keep doing everything the hard way." That hit differently. It was the first time she ever suggested accepting help from them, the same people who made me feel like a charity case from day one, the same people who never let me forget how little I had compared to them. I didn't yell, I didn't get dramatic, I just nodded and said, "I'll think about it." But deep down, I was drowning in a question I didn't want to answer. Was she still on my side? I tried to let it go, tried to believe it was just stress. But over time, even our most mundane decisions started to carry the weight of her family's expectations. Where we ate, what we wore, who we spent time with, it all had to look right just in case someone from her parents' circle saw us. I began to feel like a prop in a life someone else had scripted for me. The man I used to be, the guy who loved coding through the night, who dreamed of building something meaningful, was slowly getting buried under polite smiles and nods. But I wasn't dead yet. Something in me, call it pride, call it survival, started to wake up. I didn't know it then, but the seeds of change were being planted. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living like that. Something had to give, and eventually it did. By the time I turned 30, things were finally starting to click for me professionally. After years of late nights and side projects, one of the startups I'd freelanced for got acquired. My stock options paid out in a way I never imagined. Suddenly, I was debt-free with enough money to quit my day job and start my own company. I thought Ellie would be thrilled, and at first she was. We celebrated with champagne and paper cups in our kitchen just like we used to. I took her to Maui for a week, our first real vacation since the honeymoon. I thought maybe, just maybe, this was the moment everything turned. But it didn't. If anything, it got stranger. Her parents, who once questioned every move I made, started calling me for advice. Investment ideas. "We're looking into some commercial property," Richard said one evening over dinner. "You've got an eye for this stuff, Matt. Maybe we should go in together." I was cautious but polite. I said I'd think about it, but something felt off, like they weren't just proud of me now, they were positioning themselves around me, like circling a prize. Then came the prenup talk. It started with subtle comments from Marilyn over brunch. "Things are different now. Don't you think it's time to revisit that old agreement?" I played dumb. Then Richard pulled me aside one afternoon while Ellie and her mom were setting the table. "Matt," he said, his tone fatherly but firm, "you've built a great life, your family now. That contract, it's outdated. It doesn't reflect reality anymore." I nodded, said I'd consider it, but inside I was already on alert. That prenup had been their idea. They insisted on it when I had nothing. Now that I had something, they wanted it gone. I talked to Ellie that night, hoping she'd laugh it off. Instead, she said, "Maybe they have a point. We're not the same people anymore. You have nothing to prove." "I thought we were fine with it staying," I said. "We were," she replied, eyes downcast. "But now it just feels unnecessary." I wanted to believe she meant that, but something in her voice felt rehearsed. That week, things escalated. Ellie brought it up 3 more times. "If you trust me, what's the harm?" she asked. "Isn't our marriage worth more than a piece of paper?" I started losing sleep. I began checking our finances, tracking conversations, and watching for signs I didn't want to see. Then came the moment everything cracked. One Thursday afternoon, I got home early from a client meeting. Ellie wasn't expecting me. Her phone was on the couch, unlocked. A message preview flashed. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Missed you yesterday, T." My stomach dropped. I didn't want to believe what I saw. I picked up the phone, my hands were shaking. There were dozens of texts. Romantic, explicit, coordinated. This had been going on for months. I sat down, the phone still in hand, heart pounding like a war drum. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to confront her that second, but something held me back. Call it instinct, call it clarity. Instead, I took screenshots, transferred the photos to my laptop, and then I put her phone back exactly where I found it. That night, I didn't say a word. We had dinner like normal. I kissed her goodnight. And then I went into the guest room and stared at the ceiling until sunrise. The next day, I met with my lawyer. We went over the prenup ironclad, no spousal support, no claim to business assets. The only thing that could tip the scales was infidelity. My lawyer looked me in the eye and said, "If what you're telling me is true and you can prove it, she walks away with nothing." So that's what I did. I spent the next 2 weeks gathering every piece of proof I could without her noticing. Hotel charges, call logs, emails, even a voice memo I recorded when she was talking to T in the other room. It wasn't just betrayal, it was planned, calculated. She had waited until I became valuable to decide I was disposable. And her parents were in on it. Didn't want to believe it, but one night Marilyn called me, thinking she'd dialed Ellie. I picked up and said nothing. I told her she needs to push harder, she said. If he doesn't drop the prenup soon, she'll be stuck. That was all I needed. I forwarded the recording to my lawyer. I didn't cry, I didn't yell, I just felt hollow. I had loved Ellie with everything I had. I built a life around her. And now that life felt like a setup. The days that followed were the hardest. Every morning, I'd wake up beside someone I knew was lying to me. Every time she laughed or kissed my cheek, it felt like a performance, like I was watching someone play my wife in a movie I didn't audition for. I started noticing things I hadn't before, the late-night work meetings, the text messages she'd swipe away when I entered the room, the way she suddenly started dressing up for errands. It wasn't paranoia, it was clarity. I stopped engaging emotionally. I couldn't. My energy shifted inward. I started running again, hitting the pavement like it owed me answers. I journaled everything, trying to stay sane. I kept quiet not because I was weak, but because I needed time to prepare. Time to ensure that when I made my move, there would be no coming back. One night, I sat across from Ellie at dinner while she talked about renovating the kitchen. She was going on about quartz counters and backsplash colors, like everything was normal. I watched her, smiling and nodding, wondering how she could be so calm, knowing what she was doing behind my back. That's when I realized this wasn't impulsive cheating, this was methodical. She was waiting for me to drop the prenup, to put myself in a position where she could leave and take half of everything I had built. And her family was in on it. They were hedging their bets, pressuring me to dissolve the agreement so she could walk away rich. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust, it was a betrayal of everything I had fought for. I began to imagine what would have happened if I hadn't found the messages, if I had torn up the prenup out of love and misplaced faith, if I had handed over my life's work to someone who no longer loved me but was pretending just long enough to cash out. The thought made me physically sick. The moment of no return came 2 weeks later. Ellie's parents invited us to a dinner party. Normally, I would have declined, but this time I went. I needed to see them, to look them in the eyes, and remind myself of what I was up against. It was everything I expected. Richard poured me an expensive scotch, smiling like a man who thought he'd already won. Marilyn cornered me near the kitchen, dropping another thinly veiled suggestion. You know, sweetie, if you and Ellie are really planning a future together, it's best to keep lawyers out of your bedroom. Don't let a piece of paper come between you. Smiled. Good thing some papers are built to last. She didn't respond, just blinked slowly and walked away. That night, I wrote an email to my lawyer, "We're ready. Serve it." Filed for divorce 2 days later. I didn't tell Ellie. I let the papers do that for me. She came home to a thick envelope and a quiet house. I wasn't there. I couldn't watch her lie to me anymore, not even one more second. She called. I didn't answer. She texted. I didn't respond. All I felt was silence, and finally, peace. But the storm was just beginning. After the divorce papers were served, everything went quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence that buzzed like the air before a storm. Ellie moved out 2 days later. She didn't say much, just packed a few bags, avoided eye contact, and left her keys on the counter. I watched from the window as her car pulled away, half expecting her to stop, to run back in, to scream or cry or beg. But she didn't. She left like someone who'd already mourned what we had, and maybe she had. I didn't eat for a day. I didn't sleep for 3. I just wandered the house, opening drawers and closets, taking inventory of a life that no longer felt like mine. The rooms were full of memories. Our first Christmas, her favorite sweater draped over a chair, the dent in the wall from when we tried to hang a bookshelf and failed miserably. I hated how much I still loved those memories, hated how my brain refused to switch off the part of me that missed her. What made it worse was pretending everything was okay. Clients still needed updates, my team still had meetings, payroll still had to be approved. I smiled on video calls, made small talk, hit deadlines, but inside I was crumbling. Some nights I'd sit in the shower until the hot water ran out, just to feel something. I stopped answering texts from friends. I ignored calls from my parents. I couldn't stand the idea of explaining, or worse, hearing, "I told you so." It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the weight of everything I had sacrificed for a version of love that never existed the way I thought it did. It was realizing that for years, I had twisted myself into a quieter, more presentable version just to fit into a world that never wanted me. I started therapy because I didn't trust my own thoughts anymore. The first session, I sat across from a middle-aged woman named Dr. Patel and said, "I don't know if I'm angry or just exhausted." She nodded and said, "Why not both?" That sentence unlocked something. For the first time, I let myself say it out loud. I had been used, not just by Ellie, but by her parents, their expectations, their manipulation. And I let it happen because I believed that if I was just good enough, polite enough, successful enough, I'd finally earn a seat at their table. But that table was never meant for me. It was built to keep people like me out. I started writing again, not code, but thoughts, pages and pages of everything I was too afraid to say while I was married. I wrote about the passive-aggressive dinners, the jokes that weren't jokes, the silence from Ellie every time her parents dismissed me. I wrote about the feeling of being alone while lying in bed beside the person who said she loved me. One night I wrote, maybe I was just the bridge to the life she thought she deserved. That one hurt because it felt true. I couldn't stop asking myself what I did wrong, how I didn't see it coming sooner. Was there a moment, a decision that tipped everything over? Or was it always doomed? The worst part was the shame, not just for being cheated on, but for still loving her in some warped, echoing way, for wishing she'd call, for dreaming that this was all a test and that she'd pass it. That hope, that was the cruelest part. Because deep down, I knew she wasn't coming back. And if she did, it wouldn't be for me, it would be for the life I built. And I couldn't let her take it again. There was one night I remember clearly. It was raining hard, the kind of rain that drowns out your thoughts. I was lying on the couch, still in work clothes, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long I could keep going like this. The TV was on, but I wasn't watching. I just needed background noise to silence my own. That's when I broke. I cried, not just a few tears, but a full-body, gut-wrenching cry that had been building up for months, years, maybe. The kind of crying you do when you realize the version of life you fought for no longer exists. It wasn't just grief for Ellie, it was grief for who I used to be. For the man who believed that hard work could fix anything, for the man who thought love was enough. But even in the middle of that breakdown, something shifted. I didn't want to stay in that darkness. I didn't want to be the guy who gets crushed and never gets back up. I had worked too hard, come too far, and lost too much to let this be the end of my story. The next morning, I did something small. I changed the sheets. It sounds ridiculous, but it felt symbolic. A fresh start. I opened the windows. I threw out the leftover takeout. I replied to a few texts, even if I didn't know what to say, and I went back to therapy, this time with a notebook in hand. Dr. Patel asked me, "What does peace look like to you?" I said, "Not having to explain myself anymore." She smiled. "Then let's start there." And so I did. I wasn't okay, but for the first time in a long time, I wanted to be, and that was enough to keep going. That night, I stood outside on the porch, rain misting my face, and breathed in the quiet. No fake smiles, no tension, no one expecting me to perform or prove anything. Just me, alone, broken, but still standing. Somewhere deep inside, I felt it, the smallest flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Oh, it didn't scream, it whispered, and for the first time I listened. I didn't wake up one day suddenly over it, but I did start waking up with fewer knots in my stomach. I stopped checking Ellie's social media. I started saying yes to things again, grabbing coffee with friends, going on long walks, answering my mom's calls without letting it ring 5 times first. I poured myself into work, not as a distraction, but because I needed something to believe in again. The company I had started was still young, still finding its rhythm, and I finally had the headspace to give it the attention it deserved. For the first time, it didn't feel like I was working to prove something to someone. I was building for myself. I reconnected with my old mentor, Marcus, a retired developer who once told me every system needs a failsafe, people do too. I met him at a dusty old diner on the edge of town and told him everything. He didn't judge, he just nodded and said, "Now you know your failsafe is you." That stuck with me. I stopped trying to fix what had broken and started building something new within me. I created a daily ritual, morning runs, black coffee, no phone until 9 a.m., journaling every night. I treated myself like someone worth taking care of. One afternoon, I cleaned out our old storage closet. I found the prenup, still in the original envelope, unopened since I'd filed it away the week before our wedding. I held it in my hands for a long time. It wasn't just a legal document anymore. It was a symbol of how far I'd come. Back then, I signed it to prove I wasn't after money. Now it proves something else, that I had protected the one thing no one had a right to take, my self-respect. I didn't burn it, I didn't throw it away, I put it back, not out of bitterness, but because I didn't need to destroy it to know it no longer defined me. About 2 months after the divorce, Amy Smut, the younger sister of Ellie, reached out. She asked to meet. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. We met at a bookstore cafe. She looked nervous, said she didn't want anything, just needed to say something. "I'm sorry," she said, "for all of it. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how bad it had gotten. And I want you to know not everyone in our family is like them." I believed her. Amy always seemed like the only person in that house who saw me as a human being, not a project. We ended up talking for hours, not just about Ellie, but about life, regret, boundaries. Amy was smart, empathetic, and shockingly honest. I'd never noticed that before. She didn't try to comfort me, she just listened, and sometimes that's all healing needs. That night, I realized I hadn't thought about Ellie once during the entire conversation. That felt like progress. In the weeks that followed, Amy and I kept in touch. A message here, a coffee there. It wasn't anything romantic, at least not yet, but it was real, genuine, and I realized how rare that was. One Sunday afternoon, she invited me to help volunteer at a community center she worked with. They were organizing job training workshops for underprivileged youth. I hesitated, unsure if I could really contribute anything meaningful, but she smiled and said, "You've built a company from scratch. Just show up and talk about that." So I did. What started as a one-time favor turned into a regular habit. I'd show up once a week, sometimes more, sharing what I'd learned, not just about coding or entrepreneurship, but about failure, resilience, and getting back up. And to my surprise, I loved it. There was a moment during one session when a kid named Jaden, about 17, full of attitude, asked me, "So, you rich now or what?" The whole room laughed, and I laughed too. Then I said, "Yeah, maybe, but what matters is I didn't quit when it got hard." That line stuck with him. The next week, he showed up early. Helping others helped me. It reminded me that pain can be a gift if you use it to build something better. Meanwhile, the business was growing faster than I could have imagined. I hired 2 new project managers, expanded into a second city, and started mentoring a few early stage founders. I wasn't chasing validation anymore. I was building something sustainable, something that felt like mine. One evening, after a long day, I found myself walking past the park where I had proposed to Ellie. I stopped. I expected to feel bitterness, maybe regret, but I didn't. I felt grateful that I got out before I lost myself completely, grateful for the mess that forced me to rebuild, grateful for the reminder that love without respect isn't love, it's a transaction, and I wasn't for sale anymore. A few weeks later, Amy invited me to a small gallery opening. It wasn't my usual scene, but I said yes. The place was tucked into a quiet street full of strange, beautiful pieces. I didn't know much about art, but I knew how it felt to stand in front of something broken and still find beauty in it. We wandered through the room slowly, talking about nothing and everything. At one point, Amy stopped in front of a canvas that looked like 1,000 brush strokes, all crashing into each other. She turned to me and said, "This is what healing feels like." I didn't say anything. I just looked at her, really looked, and thought, not for the first time, how rare it was to be seen without being judged. That night didn't end with anything dramatic. No kiss, no declarations, just a quiet walk to her car, a smile, and a "see you soon." And that was enough. I went home, sat on my balcony, and watched the city breathe. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. I was healing, I was moving forward, not because I had to prove anything, but because I wanted to. And that, to me, was freedom. In the mirror now, I don't see a man who is left behind. I see someone who endured, who stood in the fire and walked out stronger, scarred but unburned. I don't know exactly what comes next, but for once, I'm not afraid of the unknown. Because whatever it is, I know I'll face it as myself, unapologetically, completely, and finally free. It was a Thursday morning when I got the letter. Thick envelope, formal letterhead from Ellie's lawyer. My stomach twisted before I even opened it. Inside, a proposal to revisit the terms of our previous legal agreement, citing recent changes in financial stability and long-term expectations. In plain English, she wanted to challenge the prenup. Again, I read it 3 times just to be sure I wasn't hallucinating. I wasn't angry, not at first. I was stunned. Then something deeper settled in. This wasn't just about money, it was about control. Even now, after everything that had happened, after she'd walked away, after she'd tried to break me down, Ellie and her family still thought they could come back and rewrite the terms of my life. But they were too late. I called my lawyer that afternoon, full defense, no settlements, let's go. He chuckled. I was hoping you'd say that. He prepared everything: bank statements, correspondence, records from the divorce, copies of texts and emails. I even had a statement from Amy confirming everything she had overheard and told me. I didn't want to use it, but I would if I had to. A week later, I got an invitation to a mediation meeting. One last chance, they said, to settle things without going to court. I showed up in a gray suit, clean shave, clear mind. Ellie was already there when I arrived. So were her parents and their lawyer. She looked different, tired, thinner, like someone who'd lost more than she realized. Her eyes flicked up to me and then down again, like she couldn't quite meet my gaze. Matt, her father began, tone syrupy, we're glad you're here. We think we can come to an arrangement that works for everyone. I leaned forward. There's only one arrangement I'm interested in. Respecting the original agreement your family insisted I sign. Anything else is a non-starter. Diane sighed dramatically. Matt, be reasonable. Things have changed. Yes, I said. I've changed. I'm no longer the man you thought you could intimidate. Ellie finally spoke. This doesn't have to be a fight. I looked at her, steady, then stop throwing punches. There was a silence so thick you could have sliced it. Their lawyer cleared his throat, shuffled some papers, tried to steer the conversation back into neutral territory. But I was done playing nice. This prenup isn't just a document, I said. It's a reminder that I once agreed to be treated as less. That ends today. When the meeting wrapped, I stood and said one last thing before leaving. You taught me a lesson I'll never forget, but you don't get to rewrite my story now that I've learned it. I walked out without looking back. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. I wasn't waiting for retaliation. I was building my peace. My lawyer filed an official response. Every request Ellie made was denied on grounds of the original prenup being fully enforced and non-negotiable, especially considering the documented infidelity and financial misconduct discovered during the divorce. They didn't push back after that. Maybe they realized they'd underestimated me again. Or maybe they just didn't have the strength to keep up the act now that their facade was cracking. I took a walk that evening. No destination, just movement. For the first time, the silence in my head wasn't hollow. It was clean, like a space had been cleared out for something better. Amy called that night. How'd it go? She asked gently. They tried, I said, but I didn't bend. There was a pause. Then she said, good, you shouldn't have to anymore. I don't know what changed between us after that. Maybe it was nothing big, just a series of small moments, tiny truths layered on top of each other until it felt like trust. We met for dinner that weekend, nothing fancy, just tacos from a food truck and a walk through the park, but it was the best meal I'd had in years. Not because of the food, but because of the company. We didn't talk about Ellie, we didn't need to. We talked about who we were becoming. At one point, Amy said, I think you scared them today, not with lawyers or threats, with how calm you were, like you didn't need anything from them anymore. I smiled, because I don't. And I meant it. There's something powerful about knowing you don't owe anyone, your silence, your submission, your forgiveness, especially when they never offered you theirs. A few weeks later, I got a letter from the court, final confirmation, the prenup stood, no appeals, no amendments, no more interference. I read it once, smiled, and slid it into a folder I labeled freedom. And that night, for the first time in years, I slept without dreaming of what could go wrong. That weekend, I visited the cabin again, the one by the river where everything had fallen apart. This time, it felt different. I brought a notebook, built a fire, and sat on the same porch where Sarah had once told me I was insecure. The memory didn't sting anymore. It felt distant, like something that had happened to someone else. I opened the notebook and wrote one sentence on the first page. This is where I stopped needing their approval. Then I closed it, threw a log on the fire, and let the night wrap around me. The stars were out, sharp, unbothered, infinite. I thought about how far I'd come. Not just financially, personally, spiritually. I was no longer a man reacting to betrayal. I was a man moving forward with intention. Amy texted me the next morning. Hope the cabin brought you peace. I replied, more than you know. She sent back a photo of her holding a coffee mug that said, "Done apologizing." I laughed, then I saved it. We weren't anything official yet, but something real was growing, something built on respect, not obligation. And that was enough for now. As I packed up the cabin and locked the door behind me, I felt something shift, not loudly, but completely. This was no longer the end of my story. It was just the beginning of one I finally got to write myself. Amy and I didn't fall into love. We walked into it slowly, carefully, like people who had seen the inside of a storm and weren't in a rush to tempt fate again. She didn't flirt, she didn't fawn, she just showed up honest, present, and quietly strong. That's what made me start to trust again. Not big declarations or dramatic moments, just small things. A shared coffee, a text that said, "You okay on a rough day?" A knowing smile when the room felt heavy. At first, I fought it, told myself we were just friends, that I wasn't ready, that it was too complicated. But the truth was, I was scared of wanting again. Because wanting means risking. It means handing someone the fragile parts of you and hoping they won't treat them like a game. But Amy never played. She listened, she asked questions, she never rushed me. One night, we sat on my porch, wrapped in 2 blankets and silent, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, just full of things we weren't saying yet. I turned to her and asked, "Are we doing this? I mean, really?" She looked at me, calm as ever. "We're already doing it, Matt. We just haven't said it out loud." That scared me more than I expected and comforted me more than I knew I needed. So I nodded. "Okay, then." And just like that, we stopped pretending. There were no fireworks, no swelling music, just 2 people who had both been through hell, choosing to try again anyway. That kind of love doesn't scream. It doesn't demand attention. It just stays. And it grows. Slow, real, earned. Being with Amy wasn't like flipping a switch. I didn't wake up one day suddenly whole, suddenly trusting again. It was more like learning how to breathe differently. There were moments, small ones, where my instincts kicked in. A missed call that made me anxious, a strange look that made me wonder if she was hiding something. Trauma leaves fingerprints. But every time I started to spiral, Amy met me with steadiness. "Matt," she'd say gently, "whatever story your head is writing right now, I promise I'm not the villain in it." And every time she was right. One weekend, she surprised me with a trip, nothing fancy, a rented cabin, a couple of fishing poles, and a cooler full of sandwiches. "You always give," she said. I wanted to give something back. That got to me more than I let on. We spent that weekend in total quiet, reading, laughing, cooking together. One night, as we watched the fire die down, I told her something I hadn't said out loud in years. I used to think love was something you had to fight for, like constantly. Like if you weren't exhausted, it wasn't real. Amy nodded slowly. And now I think maybe real love is what happens when you stop fighting. She didn't say anything right away, just reached over, took my hand, and held it like it was the most normal thing in the world. That was the night I knew I loved her. Not because it was convenient, not because I was lonely, but because with Amy, I didn't have to shrink to fit. She saw me whole, bruised maybe, but whole, and she stayed anyway. A few months in, I ran into Ellie. It was at a grocery store of all places, just a random Tuesday. She looked shocked, like she hadn't expected me to look fine, maybe even happy. She smiled politely and tried to start small talk, but I kept it brief. Not cold, just clear. There was nothing left between us but space and lessons. Later that night, I told Amy, not because I needed to, but because I wanted her to know I wasn't hiding anything. Her response? "Did you get the milk?" We both laughed and the conversation moved on. That was the difference. Amy didn't make me pay for my past. She simply accepted that it had shaped me. It's strange how healing sneaks up on you. It's not some big epiphany or dramatic breakthrough. It's noticing that you don't flinch anymore when someone raises their voice. It's realizing you haven't thought about your ex in weeks. It's reaching for someone's hand and not bracing for it to let go. One Sunday morning, Amy and I were having breakfast on the porch. The sky was soft with spring and everything felt still. She looked at me and said, I think you're finally happy. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't hesitate. I think so too. That's the thing about second chances. They don't always come with fireworks. Sometimes they arrive quietly, wrapped in patience and trust. And if you're lucky, they stay. In the months that followed, life didn't suddenly become perfect, but it felt grounded. Amy and I took things slow. We didn't rush to define what we were or where we were going. And that pace, it gave me space to breathe. I found myself waking up with more gratitude than fear. I started journaling again, rebuilding friendships I'd let slip, even reached out to my parents more just to say hi. I realized something. Peace isn't the absence of chaos, it's the presence of clarity. One evening, I caught Amy staring at me from across the room. When I asked what she was thinking, she just said, "I like watching you be okay." That hit harder than I expected, because for the longest time, I didn't think I'd ever be okay again. But I am. And maybe that's the real victory here. Not the money, not the prenup, not even the escape from a toxic marriage. The real win? I found myself again. And this time, I'm not giving him up for anyone. If you'd told me 5 years ago that I'd be sitting here writing this with a sense of peace in my chest instead of rage or regret, I would have laughed. Back then, everything felt like survival. Every day was a negotiation between pain and pride. I was in a marriage that looked fine on the outside but was quietly eroding the core of who I was. The constant need to prove myself, to justify my worth, to tolerate the whispers and the tension and the silences. It wore me down in ways I didn't even realize until I stepped away from it. Looking back now, the signs were always there. I just didn't want to see them. Sarah's family never saw me as an equal. I was a project at best and a placeholder at worst, and I let that shape how I showed up for her, for them, for myself. The prenup, it wasn't just paperwork. It was a mirror, a reflection of all the doubts they had about me and maybe the doubts I hadn't yet admitted I had about myself. But here's the thing about pain. It teaches, sometimes harshly, sometimes slowly, but always thoroughly. What I've learned in the years since is this: love isn't supposed to feel like a constant audition. You shouldn't have to perform for acceptance or barter your value for peace. Real love, the kind that's worth holding on to, is rooted in respect, not obligation. In truth, not appearances. Amy showed me that. Not through grand gestures or romantic cliches, but through consistency, through the kind of quiet presence that doesn't flinch when your scars show, through a patience that allowed me to come undone and rebuild without fear of being abandoned. But more than Amy, I had to show that to myself. I had to learn how to stand still in my own skin, to look in the mirror and not see a man who failed, but a man who grew. A man who chose not to repeat the cycles that broke him. A man who stopped confusing sacrifice with love and control with care. That's not a lesson you get from books or podcasts. It's earned in the trenches of disappointment and the slow climb back to self-trust. Money didn't save me, but it did reveal people. That's one of the hardest truths I had to face. The more I succeeded, the more clearly I saw who was clapping because they cared and who was clapping because they wanted a piece of it. Sarah's parents didn't just want me to tear up the prenup. They wanted control, they wanted access, they wanted to rewrite the story so they could benefit from a version of me they never believed in to begin with. I'm not bitter about it anymore. If anything, I'm grateful. Because without their push, I might never stood still long enough to realize I was done playing nice just to keep the peace. I stopped measuring myself against their standards. I stopped apologizing for having boundaries. And when I did that, everything changed. The silence in my life became a source of strength, not shame. I started choosing people who chose me back. I stopped explaining my worth in rooms that only saw dollar signs. I stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. And you know what? I started breathing easier. There's a kind of freedom in knowing that you walked through fire and didn't come out bitter, just better. Not harder, just clearer. Not colder, just more aware of where your warmth is welcome. These days, I don't chase closure. I don't need revenge. I don't even really think about Sarah or her family unless someone brings them up. They're part of my story, but they don't get to define it. Amy and I still take it one day at a time. We're not rushing labels or planning weddings. We're just being, and that's more than enough. Some nights, I still sit on the same porch where it all began, with a drink in hand and the sound of wind in the trees. And I think about everything I lost. Then I think about everything I gained. And I smile. I used to think that healing would look like some big moment, an apology, a confrontation, a scene where I'd finally say all the things I never said. But real healing, it's not loud, it's not cinematic. It's Saturday mornings when I sleep in without guilt. It's looking at my bank account and feeling secure, not anxious. It's answering a call from Amy and smiling before I even pick up. It's peace. Sometimes people ask if I regret signing that prenup. And my answer? Not for a second. Because if I hadn't, I might have never seen the truth. I might have kept waiting for people to value me who never would. I might have missed the chance to reclaim my own story. So no, I don't regret it. It taught me everything I needed to know about love, loyalty, and most importantly, my. If there's one thing I want someone reading this to remember, it's this. You don't have to earn your worth. You don't have to beg for respect. And you sure as hell don't have to stay small just to be loved. Find the people who see you clearly. And if you can't yet, become that person for yourself. I did. And lives never felt more honest, more quiet, more mine.